Boss fights, they're the moment, the payoff, the climax, the reason you kept playing. That music shift, the door locking behind you, a second life bar appearing. Suddenly everything got real. Like the game had been building to this moment the entire time. But if you took that out, would it even feel like a complete experience anymore? Naturally, we tell ourselves a simple story. Boss fights exist to test you, to push your skills further, to combine everything you've learned up to that point so that you're prepared for the hardest, most important part of a game. The peak, the reward for getting good. At least, that's what we think they're supposed to be. But there's something about that explanation that doesn't really add up, because when you go back and actually look at these games again, what you were doing right before the boss fight isn't all that different from what you were doing during it. For instance, in Super Mario Bros., you're already running, jumping, and dodging through each level. Then you reach Bowser, and suddenly it feels bigger, even though you're still just running, jumping, and dodging. The only thing that's really changed is now it's over lava. In the Mega Man series, you spend entire levels learning enemy patterns, positioning, timing your shots. Then you walk into a boss room. True, you get destroyed in about 3 seconds, try again, and then get destroyed slightly slower, but eventually you realize, oh, I see how this works. You recognize the pattern. In The Legend of Zelda, it's the same. Throughout the game, you're managing items, learning enemy patterns, figuring out when to strike and with what. And then you hit a boss, and it feels like it gets more intense, but not fundamentally different. Nothing you're doing is actually new. You're still managing items, learning the patterns, figuring out when to strike and with what. So here's the question. Why do bosses feel so important when they're built on the exact same actions you are already doing? Why does the game suddenly feel like it matters more without actually changing all that much? Boss fights feel like climaxes because early games had no other way to create one. Now that sounds obvious, but let's dive deeper. Because for a long time, games didn't even need a climax. They were built around score. You played to last longer, to go further, to beat your previous high score. There was no final moment, no resolution, no reason for the game to build toward anything. But that started to change. As games moved onto home consoles, they shifted towards something new. Completion. Clearing stages, defined endings, a sense that you were supposed to finish the game. And that created a problem, because now games needed to feel like they were building towards something significant. They needed structure, they needed a climax. But the hardware still wasn't great at supporting that. The NES had 2 kilobytes of onboard RAM. That's about the size of a small text document. There were strict limits on how many enemies could even be on screen. Push it too far, and as you probably remember, the game would start breaking. The screen would flicker, sprites would disappear, there'd be massive slowdown. Cartridges were tiny, storage was limited. So developers couldn't just keep introducing new mechanics or constantly evolve the experience. They had to reuse what already worked, which meant most of the game was built on repetition. The same action, the same patterns, the same ideas over and over. Different level, same problems. And if you just let that run, does anything really stand out? Does anything feel like it matters? Does the game give you a satisfying resolution? So they needed a way to force that feeling, not by adding more content, but by changing how the player experiences it. And that's what boss fights are. They take everything the game can't sustain over time and compress it into a single memorable moment. They lock you into one encounter, remove all distractions, slow everything down, and punish mistakes harder. Not to expand the experience, but to focus it. To force a shift in perception that makes you feel, wow, this moment matters. Because if you remove boss fights from these games, look at what's left. In Super Mario Bros., you're just running and jumping, again and again and again. No clear endpoint, No moment that says, my work here is done. Imagine Mega Man without the boss fights. They anchor the entire game. Without them, you're just moving through stages. Nothing actually punctuates the experience. No moment that separates one section from the next. It just keeps going. And without that separation, without that forced intensity, without that signal, it doesn't escalate. Without boss fights, these games don't build. They just repeat. Once you see that, you start to realize something else. During the 8 and 16-bit era, there wasn't really an alternative. These weren't experimental design choices. This was the default structure of many games. Look again at one of the earliest examples, Super Mario Bros. Every world is divided into 4 sections, and the fourth always ends in a castle. That's not just level design, that's the game creating a boundary. Without that, it's just more running and jumping. The game doesn't escalate, it doesn't resolve, it just continues. Boss fights weren't there to enhance progression, they created the feeling of progression. At that point, they weren't really optional anymore. They were solving a problem nothing else really could. And that's why boss fights tend to create the most vivid memories we have of a particular game. Not because they were the hardest part necessarily, but because they marked something significant. Think about it. If you're like me, you probably don't remember most levels, but what you do remember is those moments in Super Metroid when the boss music kicked in, or the bridge collapsing under Bowser, or reaching the end of a level in Ninja Gaiden and knowing if you mess up, you're doing that entire section over again. You remember the moments where the game stopped being routine, where everything slowed down, where the game told you, this is different. Boss fights didn't just challenge you, they anchored your memory of the experience. They gave shape to something that otherwise didn't have one, and this shows up everywhere. In Contra, the action never really changes until a boss forces you to stop and focus. In Sonic the Hedgehog, speed defines most levels, but every zone ends with you slowing down to face Dr. Robotnik. In the early Zelda games, entire dungeons and their mechanics exist just to build toward a boss encounter. The boss isn't just an enemy, it's the moment the game becomes meaningful. So despite what we often remember, boss fights weren't just a payoff. They were the structure holding everything together. They made short, repetitive games feel like complete journeys. And once you see that, something else becomes obvious. Boss fights didn't disappear. Their job just changed. They're not there to hold the experience together anymore, and that's why they feel different now. Boss fights didn't feel special because they were the point. They felt special because they had to be. So I want to know what you think. What do you actually remember from the games you played back in the day? The levels or the boss fights? Let me know in the comments below, and if you made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy gaming, my friends.